Eric.
Omar.
Laurin,
Hey,
how are you doing?
I'm doing much better today. Yesterday was a little rough, not gonna lie. I managed. I didn't fall asleep at 4 p.m. like I wanted to. But over here in New Zealand,
What happened? Like, what's with the sleep thing? I understand you went on a tiny flight.
a short flight, a
Yeah.
short, quick flight over here. So from Florida, I flew to Chicago, which seemed very cumbersome and unnecessary. But anyways, flew there. And then flew from Chicago to Auckland was 16 and a half hours. And we were on the tarmac for at least 30, if not 45 minutes, even before that. No Wi-Fi and no sunlight. And just a weird, like, when you land, and then I landed, it was like 6:30 or 7 in the morning. So then you're just like, what is happening? And then obviously having to stay awake to work and not just, completely ruin the day. We did have a great day though. We saw some cool stuff. What was that place called again?
So we went up to this top of the Sky Tower,
Sky Tower.
Thought?
which is Sky Tower. It's an iconic building here in Auckland. And it was good enough weather to get a sense of the whole city. We're in Ismouth, so we got like a double bay in Auckland. So the weather changes constantly. Like literally, when we were on the call with you, it was raining outside, and now it's a beautiful clear day.
Yeah.
Can we pause, Laurin? I'm going to get back to you. You said Innsmouth. Eric, how do you spell that
I think
area?
it's Isthmus,
Oh.
ITHSMUS.
Thank God it's not INNS.
Innsmouth.
Innsmouth. I thought, man, I'm like, could that be a Kiwi way? Okay, so we're avoiding Cthulhu because Laurin was talking about essentially being in purgatory as she traverses the great darkness to land in New Zealand.
Yes.
Eric, I'll give you a compliment because we were just together not even a week ago. This man does the damn thing, the flight, and he said it ain't no big thing. And then we proceeded to lift, and the lifting session went well. And then Eric said, I'm just going to disappear for a minute. And then I didn't see him for the next day. But when I saw him in person, he seemed like you could not tell the man went on a 16-hour flight. So I'm wondering what the secret is.
Definitely better than me because I did not train yesterday.
So I'll actually give a serious answer.
Yeah.
So because I do have a procedure that I go through for the long flights because I'm used to them at this point, believe it or not. So the first thing I do is that I get onto the target time zone as soon as I can. So I will bring melatonin with me, and I take it at the time point of when it will be night there. So to get on that rhythm. Another thing I do is that I train the day I leave, and I train the day I get there. And I make sure I go on a walk when I get to both places when it's sunny, because all those things seem to help me acclimate faster. The other thing I do is that on the way back to New Zealand, because I find it's more important, like after a vacation, you get back and you're like behind, especially when you get a 16-hour flight and you don't have Wi-Fi, which happens sometimes, right? You can't even keep up. So when I get home, I always try to arrive between like 5:30 to 7 a.m., somewhere in there. And then I stay up for the flight back because like to come back to New Zealand, I had to fly from Lubbock to Houston, and then Houston, direct flight to Auckland, nearly as long as Chicago. It's about an hour shorter. So I stay up the whole time until the last 8-hour block, which helps make you tired.
Yeah.
And of course, take melatonin, and then I'm able to sleep for whatever degree I can. And then I don't normally caffeinate very much because I'm trying to be able to sleep on prep. But the day I get home, I caffeinate as needed to make it all the way till the appropriate time, 10 p.m. time.
I pretty much did all of those things.
It still sucks. Though.
I trained. I didn't train yesterday, but I trained before I left.
Hear that?
I did it.
She admitted didn't train yesterday.
Yes.
I invited her. I said, let's go.
And I said, go fuck yourself. I didn't say that.
Yeah,
But I said, I'm going to work. And then he said, no, you're going to fall asleep. I said, no, I'm not. And then I fell asleep.
Yeah.
But I trained before I left. I walked. We walked when we got here. Did all the things. But, it's just, I haven't done a trip like that since we went to Singapore. So, which was the last time I was on the podcast. Crazy full circle moment.
Thank you, Laurin, for keeping us on track. That was a little segment we call Traveling Tips with Eric Helms. We're trying different things to be in different categories, but Laurin Conlin is back on the podcast. It's been just about, 3.5 years. Before we do that, Eric, can I read one quick review based on the last episode? We had that Road to Ronnie episode, then the Ronnie recap. It's a 5-star review. And what the person says is, who's Ronnie Coleman? And that's the... No, it's not. It's not. There's no review like that. But full circle mode. There are some reviews probably I should be reading, but I do want to pay Laurin proper respects. It is great to have you on. For the OGs who've stuck around, and maybe they can leave a comment on YouTube. Out of curiosity, how long have you been listening to the podcast? Because now we've been going on for over 4 years. So it would be at the end, Eric, as kind of Laurin said, end of year 1. And so now you guys are back. You're presenting both at the same conference. You endured that laborious journey. Welcome once again to Iron Culture.
Yes, thank you for having me back on. I'm super excited, and I love this topic, and I think it's going to be great. We were discussing this over coffee, overlooking the city yesterday, and then we both were like, wait, let's do this. So it's a good topic. I'm ready.
So we got cool stuff on the horizon. Laurin and I are going to be going over to Melbourne, which is just a quick flight for us here in New Zealand of only 4 hours to present at the UEBC. So big shout out to JPS Health and Fitness. They've been hosting the Ultimate Evidence-Based Conference every year since I want to say 2018. And in the 2 years where we had COVID, they did the UEBC wireless. So this is Laurin's first in-person one because you did the wireless.
Yes.
And it's I don't know, I think I've done them all. Not that I'm trying to big up you, Laurin, but I have done all of the UEBC.
Sounds good. No, I'm not nervous for anything. Just kidding.
Yeah, don't worry. It's really high expectations, standards. Yeah. Besides that, you'll do great. Actually, Laurin, so for anyone of you who has been a more recent listener, can you introduce yourself a bit? Just who you are, what you're about, what you do?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, how many episodes is this? I'm just curious. What?
235?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Damn.
Yeah.
Wow.
Good up there.
It's up there. I love it. Now that's my brain. Now I'm like having an Omar moment. Well, we have to talk about this, and then you guys get it. So, hi, my name is Laurin Conlin. I'm so bad at intros. I'm like, who am I? I don't know. Like as soon as someone asks me to introduce myself, I'm like, I don't know. Who am I?
Who are you?
Question.
Do I have to introduce you now? I will do that. I'll take the burden from you. So we have Laurin Conlin on.
It was not always a dipshit, but right
no, she's a part-time dipshit, but she is a full-time badass. Yeah. So she got her master's degree with Dr. Bill Campbell, who we've had on. She specifically did it looking at flexible dieting. She published the only comparative trial that I'm aware of people dieting using an if it fits your macros approach compared to a more meal plan strict dieting approach, strict in quotation marks there, relatively. Not only that, she's been coaching in this space for like a decade. She's a fantastic coach, not just of physique competitors, although she does that as well. And oh, by the way, she also is an IFBB Bikini Pro. So professional athlete, professional coach, professional dipshit, professional badass.
Hey,
it's pretty good.
That was a way better intro than I would have given. So thank you, Eric.
You're welcome.
Not good at intros. It should be my intro.
Look, Eric, you nailed it. Now the audience is up to date. If they weren't listening, they are going to be grilled. Why weren't you listening to episode 51? Why haven't you stuck around all this time? You don't remember Laurin. And this is a scintillating episode, okay? Perhaps a monster episode. We'll see. Because, Laurin, I want you to introduce the topic. There are a couple probably different paths we could go on. But as Eric alluded to, you're a top shelf coach, not just for, figure, bikini, and so on and so forth, but, and you're also an IFBB Pro, okay? Ronnie Coleman ain't got shit on you. Got to give another Ronnie Coleman shout out. Oh. Yeah. Ronnie, imagine Ronnie now listens. I actually would feel terrible. Imagine he listens and he just writes it. He's like, yeah, he's like, you fellas were awfully nice in person. Why you have to say that? I want to apologize, Ronnie. Okay, he was nothing but gracious with us. But you kick it off with this topic, and then we'll follow you.
Yeah. So we were talking yesterday about the competition trap, right? Specifically, we were talking about in competition, but I do think it's good that we can open this up to just kind of social media in general, right? And just like the desire to always be lean and stay relevant. So it kind of all centers around this trap of staying too lean for too long in the for the reason of being relevant, right? Or feeling like you have to do this for some kind of external pressure. And that's really where I think all of this stems. So it can, if somebody's listening and they're not a competitor, you're still going to be able to extract things from this if you have ever felt this way, whether it's social media, whether it's your business, content related. But we can definitely start with the competition kind of track, because I think that that is so prevalent. And as someone, I started competing 2011 was my first show. And after my first show, I realized, okay, wow, I really, had a very clear understanding that I needed to take some time off, right? It wasn't like even up for debate. But then in 2013, when I came back, I pretty much competed almost straight from 2013 to 2018. I had some, few month breaks in between. But it was very much like just go, go, go. And that's very common in the NPC and the IFBB. In order to, there's always shows to turn pro, right? There's 6 a year. And so for the national shows, it's always like, oh, I need to get in front of the judges. I need to show up and do better. And that's true, right? There is a point of this, physique sports are subjective. So being in front of judges consistently so that they're seeing, okay, oh, well, this is Laurin and this is what she looked like at the last show. And oh, that face looks familiar. Oh, she looks familiar. Oh, she's made some improvements. Like it makes sense to do a handful of shows in order to stay in front of the judges, to get their feedback, to make the changes. And to be fair, if you are competing, I would recommend, and I certainly recommend to my clients, we should be doing several shows. Like if it's within their budget, and of course it makes sense for their life. But I really don't see the point of just doing like a show if you can have the ability to do more than one in a season. But that doesn't mean that every single year we have to be doing multiple shows with these long preps with very short off seasons, right? And like that's where these adaptations really compound physiologically, but then also just psychologically. We could definitely talk about the physiological stuff, but I find that the psychological stuff, I would say, is probably more detrimental of like this constant rat race of like, if I don't do this, then like nobody's going to know who I am. And then your whole self-worth gets tied into competing. And then you look up and you're like, whoa, now I have all these issues and my life's kind of fallen apart after 4 years of doing this.
Yeah, this is something I started noticing. I want to say the bikini division launched in 2009, which was my second season. It took a little while to come into the big natural bodybuilding organization. So for me to get a kind of sense of it, it would have been another few years after that. And then we got a lot of bikini competitors. And the thing that kind of surprised me was that you would expect, based upon the competitive division rules and what's judged, that it would be a less stressful process to go through bikini prep. You don't have to be quite as lean as figure. You definitely don't have to be lean as physique. The prep shouldn't take as long, and the demands in terms of muscularity aren't as high, right? Now, that's not to say there aren't other demands. There's actual more demands on do you move gracefully. It's a more active role. It has more elements of more subjective beauty. So there's a lot more attention you have to give to the way you present on stage than necessarily the aspects of muscularity or leanness. But from a physiological perspective, like you were saying, on paper, you'd think, okay, this should be less stressful. You don't have to get as lean. Maybe you could compete more often. But what I was consistently seeing as a coach and just as someone participating in the space and as an athlete, just being backstage with other people, was that the bikini competitors seem to be suffering and struggling more than other divisions pretty early on into the emergence of the division. And I had to think about that, like, why is that happening? And as I became more involved in the community and the culture, I realized there was seemingly almost this unique pressure of they need to compete regularly, they need to be seen, they need to kind of almost more like a fitness model, be out there.
Yes.
And I think it's one thing to go, oh, right, I don't have to get as lean. I can diet for 12 weeks versus 24. And, then I can just gain another 5 pounds back and do it again next year. Like, yeah, that's true. But then you're compounding those stresses and that lack of under recovery. Whereas the bodybuilder who puts 20 pounds back on within the 2 months after their show, they're almost ready to rock again. But they also need time to build muscle. And if the bikini competitor's like, well, I didn't get more feedback, I need to get much bigger. Maybe I just need to tweak this one little thing here and there. So I'm ready to go next year. Because, Omar, I tell you what, when Laurin was just saying I competed 2013 every season through 2018, unfathomable to me to do that. I mean, I could, but I would be like, all right, I'm not progressing. And I'm just right when the point when I'm mentally recovered, I'm diving back in. Now there are, and I'm almost looking retrospectively, because I think right now I probably could compete more frequently because I have the experience I have. But to expect me to have done that when I was a young man and the age most of these bikini competitors are at early on in their careers, man.
Yeah, it was pretty brutal, and you hit on a really good point in terms of it being more like a fitness model, right? And there's a pressure of that because there's this marketability, right? To whether it's if you do want to be, modeling, right? Like in that kind of a way, because there's still like, you're muscular and you're lean, but it's still within like a more much less than, like, how do I say this? Much less than some of the other divisions, right?
It's more in line with the general society view of what a
Yes.
fitness model is.
Yes. So you can still do that. And then, of course, you can work with companies if people are trying to, work in different aspects in the industry that way. But also just the kind of like the notion in general is that, well, you don't need as much muscle, so you don't need as much time to build, right? And that was the same thing that we saw with men's physique, right? And like how that blew up. And like, to be fair, like, yes, there is a much lower barrier to entry for a bikini athlete and a men's physique athlete than there are for, physique and, bodybuilding athletes, right? Like, that's undeniable. However, that doesn't mean that those clients don't need time to build muscle in the right areas. And that doesn't mean that they don't need time off to recover. And especially now, I would argue like the bikini division and the NPC and the IFBB in particular, like, they're not muscular.
Sure.
Like when it first started, for sure. You know what I mean? Like, they had, great muscle tone and shape and they were lean, but it was still in a not the extreme way that we see now. Like, now the top, 5, 6, 10 at the Olympia, like, you're like, I mean, everybody pretty much at the Olympia, but like, it's a substantially different look that is no longer just like, oh, this is, this, just walk in, this is pretty easy. Like, it's not like that. We've very much gotten past that. And especially too, and I don't coach any men's physique athletes, but just watching men's physique in general, it's not just like the board shorts off the beach kind of look. Like, to be fair, because men's physique, up
They're
until
huge.
now, they don't have a weight class. So they're honestly some of the freakiest looking people, because it's like there is nothing that they have to, no restraints. So that, kind of has really changed, but that the notion hasn't. Do you know what I mean? Like, the actual judging criteria has changed, but the mindset of like, oh, I can just jump into this, is still there. And the first season or two that someone really wants to just, like, if they have a decent foundation and then they decide to diet and they get really lean and you have, decent shape, like, you can look pretty good, and then that's kind of when you start to reveal, like, all right, where do I need to, add a little bit more? Where do I need to downsize here, bring this up, whatever it might be. But what happens is that people just, again, don't think about that. And then they're like, oh yeah, I'll just make a little tweak, because the judges will say things like that. Like, oh, you just need a little bit more here. And then, oh, a little bit, that'll take a week or two, and like, we all like shorten that time frame for like what is actually necessary. And it's really tough, especially like if a client is really close, right? And you're like, okay, you really don't need to make any changes. You could probably compete more frequently, right? Like, if someone is kind of like at the muscularity that they need, maybe a few tweaks here and there. But to be honest, most people, especially new athletes, are not there, unless you've been training for a really long time coming into this. Like, you're going to need to build in certain areas. And like, yeah, I can get you shredded, but like, once you get lean enough, like, it doesn't really matter if the shape's not there. But that pressure is still there, because it's still like, oh yeah, the bikini's the easy one. It's like, please look at the athlete. Like, if you really looked at this, like, it would look like, to an untrained person, you'd be like, oh yeah, they look great. But like, to anybody who's ever trained or any coach, like, you're going to look at that and be like, this is not a easily attainable look. Like, it's just not. Like, it's not. And I think we can all just like, let's all just move past that and recognize that, like, the bikini division requires, I don't want to say just as much time, because it obviously not, but it's going to require time to build that physique.
So, Laurin, I want to get to this aspect of pressure that competitors feel, but can we rewind for a second? I have largely the prism of one Hunky Helms with his bodybuilding journey to understand why people compete, but I want to understand, and maybe the audience as well, the appeal of choosing to compete in bikini for yourself and for people that choose to do that? You said kind of because the goal physique is more similar to societal expectations, there might be additional opportunities either for modeling or so on. So what would you say is the appeal first of competing specifically in bikini versus physique and figure? And what has been your experience with your clients? And then from there, I do want to then jump forward into this pressure, whether it's, like self-imposed, but also then from coaches, the society, all those things. But first, can you define for us, what do you find the appeal to be in bikini? And then also, what do your clients find?
I would say that honestly, with any division, you really need to look at not only the end physique, right? Like the on-stage physique, but you also need to look at the off-season physique, right? And so for me, it was a very easy thing for me to recognize. Like when I first started, I actually started as a figure competitor because I have a pretty broad structure. So it's kind of right. Like I'm, tall, broad, like I have this shape. But then, realized pretty early on that, okay, I am like kind of a lanky, leaner look. I'm at that point still, but was choosing not to take any performance-enhancing drugs. It's like, all right, probably not going to be really in line with where I want to go, right? Like looking at realistically who's winning these shows, even back then, like even in 2013 when I was still doing figure then was completely different than it is now 10 years later, right? But even then I was like, I'm just not quite there yet. And then somebody actually recommended that I try bikini, and I was like, bikini? Like, like, what are you talking about? And it was funny because at the last national show that I did as a figure competitor, people were like, hey, where's the bikini line? Hey, where's the And I'm like, I'm not a bikini girl. And then I looked, my friend was like, girl, and she was like, showed me who had just won the show that I'd just done. And I was like, okay, yeah, I kind of look like that. If I changed my posing, I'd probably kind of look like that. And then because the first show that I ever went to was in 2010, and I saw bikini. It was a year in. It was a show in South Florida, and I was like, this is a hot mess. Like, I'm not going to do this. But of course, as everything, more people do it. The requirements change. So for me, I really looked at like, all right, what is my body type probably suited for? And, realistically, what do I want to look like? And then I also thought, the longer that I did it, I was like, realistically, what do I want to look like in an off season, right? And I think people underestimate that because they see, even like, let's say like a figure competitor, right? And they see how great they look on stage. And I'm like, you realize that that's not the size that you're going to be all year, right? Or a wellness competitor, right? Now, if anybody is following NPC or IFBB wellness, you have to really consider, like, is this the size that I want to be? And if the answer is yes, then that's fine. But you have to recognize that it's not just, the shredded tie-ins and, all this stuff. It's like, what are you going to look like on a day-to-day basis? So for me, it was pretty easy. It was, what did I want to look like for all seasons of life, right? Because you have to, you're on stage for a handful of shows a season, but like, how else are you going to be happy the rest of the time walking around? And then also too, like just genetically, like some people are going to just fit within better categories, right? If someone has just naturally pretty big legs and they just always add size really quickly there, but they don't really have the upper body to match. And they're like, you know what, like I'm digging the wellness. Let's try it. We all work with different clients who have different physiques. And there's some people who are like, no, you're definitely figure. No, you're definitely bikini. And when wellness first came out, there was kind of like a maybe, you could be a bikini or a wellness. Now it's not even like remotely a maybe. Like
They're
it's
very
like
different.
you're very distinctly going to look one way or the other. Or you should, be training for one or the other. So, there's some crossovers and not to say that some people can't do both well, because there's obviously some people whose just shape and size and insertions and everything can look good in both divisions. But I would say, typically speaking, there's going to be people who kind of naturally gravitate towards. And then also, this is where you do listen to the judges. If you continue to do shows and they're like, hey, you'd do better here. Hey, you would do better here. Then it's like, okay, now I had to make the decision. Do I want to go there or do I not want to? And do I want to change my physique for the division that I'm currently in? Or do I want to just not do this at all? So I think a big part of it is like, what do you want to do, like realistically, like with your body like, what do you want that to look like pretty much year round, like through all of those seasons? And then you can make a better decision.
So dovetailing off that, Laurin, there are so many divisions now. For those uninitiated in bodybuilding on the men's side, we have not only classic, but we have open bodybuilding. We have 212, which is basically the same, but it's for shorter bodybuilders, right? And then we also have, men's physique. And on the women's side, we have wellness, which rewards more muscular quads, a little more lower body,
Yeah,
those
very
more muscular legs.
very lower body dominant.
Right.
Like, oof,
Mhm.
it is impressive, but
Yep.
yeah, it is not just like, oh, you weren't in shape. Like, it's not that. It's not like, oh, I got big legs. Like, no. Like, it's very muscular legs.
Yeah, it's like bodybuilder from the waist down, essentially. Yeah. And then we have bikini, which is, I think people are pretty familiar with. It's a lot more of just kind of your classic symmetry and then large, well-developed glutes.
Okay.
Good shoulders, but nothing overdeveloped anywhere else.
No.
And then we have figure, which is actually
Balanced, I would say.
very balanced. And there's not a huge difference, I'll say this to help people understand, in natural natural federations, physique and figure is really not that different. They have similar conditioning standards. You have to be muscular everywhere. The difference is in figure, you wear heels and you go through the mandatory poses. But a good bodybuilder can typically chuck on the heels. It's different in IFB NPC because I'll be frank, there's different doses, right?
Yeah.
Figure competitors are huge, but physique and female bodybuilders are as huge as possible.
Yeah, substantially larger. I will say that there are some people who end up doing, I'm gonna say classic, who end up doing physique, who actually aren't as big, but they just have that, like, they're just a lot leaner, and maybe they don't have as, as like that perfect X frame.
They're freakier.
Yeah, so there's just different. Again, there's going to be different people who you'd be like, why is that person doing physique? But like, because they're not as big as maybe some of the figure girls, but the way that their shape looks, it just fits better for that versus someone who in figure might just really have those really wide shoulders and back, really tiny waist, and there still is a lot more of like a from the bottom, like bikini probably has has the largest emphasis on the overall like package. And you were alluding to that in the beginning, like, the look and the flow and the transitions and all of that. And then as each division gets more muscular, there's a little bit less of an emphasis on that. It's still there. Like, you're not going to be doing well in women's physique and not have a good flow. You know what I mean? Like nobody who's winning does that, but it's just a completely different look, especially in terms of like hair and makeup. And like, that's a huge aspect of bikini, as well as wellness, and figure too. Like, they all have it. It's just going to be a sliding scale.
So do you think with that look that there are, beyond just like what you feel your body might look like, do you think it attracts a different type of person, or do you think that people use it more often as a means to an end rather than an actual endpoint? So I'll give you a parallel. For me, I didn't get into bodybuilding because I wanted to start a coaching company or because I wanted to hopefully become a fitness model in the magazines. Or because I wanted to start an acting career. And like, this is something, we have archetypes for that. Like, your Arnold's, or a lot of people who eventually they get a supplement deal or a sponsorship and they don't compete anymore. They just look awesome and do something with it. Do you think it's more often that people will decide to compete in bikini because they want to see it as a launching point?
I'm honestly not sure. I really truthfully do not know. I guess I could just philosophize about this, right? Like, I could just maybe think of, like, I would say that probably with how large of an industry it is now, and how large the appeal of social media and, kind of like we were talking about being relevant just in general is for a lot of people, I think that there certainly could be a larger increase, and not just with bikini, but again, bikini is going to have a lower barrier to entry, even though we've discussed that it's still a lot more muscular. Than maybe previous years. You know what I mean? Maybe 10 years ago when people were in the industry, like even 10 years ago, like bodybuilding was still like weird as fuck. People were like, oh, you're going to go to a show and this is going to be the super eccentric people and this is going to be all whatever. Now it's, yes, there's still weird people, like bodybuilding is still very niche and interesting, but it's definitely just a lot more like mainstream. And I don't know, again, is that because of social media? Is that because of just content? Is that because it's just gained more popularity over time? Like, I'm not really too sure, but there's less of the like weird, like, okay, I'm going to go to like this gym and be in this like dungy gym in like a corner and like not talk to anybody and have my hoodie up and like train, every day and then just show up to a show kind of vibe versus like, I like this division. I want to maybe work with some companies. I'm posting every day of my journey online. I'm, getting attention for this. I'm like, there's definitely just a different thing now, and it's funny. Like, I even, I haven't I haven't been to the gym I was training at this time in a really long time. And it was kind of like that like afternoonish time, like the awkward time where you're like, oh, nobody's going to be there. But the gym is definitely more of like it has some influencer type, like people there, right? Like younger. And I can all tell like they're getting into training, and like they maybe compete and whatever. And it's definitely just interesting to watch because I'm like, that is not how, like when I started training and like started doing all this, like just not how it was, and there's just definitely like a different thing. And I don't know if that's just like, is that because of like TikTok? Is that because of people getting into Vibe? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know what the difference is because even back, like, I guess counterpoint is like back, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, like getting a sponsorship deal, I feel like there was more opportunity for like the hardcore bodybuilding types and all of that then than there is now, right?
It's all shifted to classic.
But even like, I just mean in general, like now a lot of times it's like just like the influencer kind of culture in general, which just has a certain look, but they're not competing.
Yeah,
And again, that's going back to like marketability, and that's going. So I think some people are like seeing those opportunities, and like I know personally a lot of like people who are actual influencers who are very attractive, very in shape. They don't compete, you know what I mean?
Right.
They just like look good, and they have these actual like brand deals because they make their living off of doing this. And I think a lot of people are seeing that, and they're like, oh well, that person, because those people could compete if they wanted to. Like they'd have to tweak a few things, but it's like maybe people are seeing that and they're like, oh, well, I want to compete. And then I also see that. So maybe I could like blend them. I don't know. It's very interesting. I actually coach a lot more masters competitors now than I used to. I don't know if that's because I'm getting older or if that's just because of like the type of content that I'm putting out and the message that I'm sharing. Again, we talk about the pressure of like the teams and all that. Like that's just, don't really have all that with my company. So I'm attracting a lot more masters competitors, and they're doing it because they're genuinely interested in competing. Do you know?
Yeah. Okay.
So I'm not really attracting the 20 to 28-year-old like new competitor. So I don't really have a good answer to that, but I would say it's probably I would be interested to just to know if it really has to do more with just like the general culture of influencer culture bleeding into a little bit of bodybuilding. Right, because the parallels there are pretty close for certain looks.
Right.
Like we all know people who are influencers who've never competed. Who are like, yeah, if you change a few things, like you could do a men's physique show, you could do a bikini show, and do well. So I don't know how much of it is like that, and then those people just find a show and they decide to do it, or it's interesting. I'll have to think more on that.
I guess Eric, we're going to get into this topic a little bit, and I think Eric, you framed that up well. Laurin, I appreciate the transparency in the answer because we're trying to understand, especially for myself, from an outsider's perspective, the different divisions, right, within women's bodybuilding. What's more popular? What's the progression over the last, let's say, decade? Why do people participate? And then maybe that influence. Just to give a quick little commentary about influencers in general, or their influence, pun intended, on the space. I question if people are different or the environment just changes. And what I mean when I say that, opportunities arise as the market obviously grows and there's more participants in the space and there's actually, money to be made. So then people are incentivized to perform certain actions. I don't know, like speaking about Eric's completely different, competing in bodybuilding, his own choice. He's given fantastic explanations, but I don't know if any of my cohorts from the time I started participating on social media on YouTube, let's say 2009, 2010. So like this is like proto YouTube. If they were given the same opportunities, if they would still, act the way in which they acted, or if they would have accepted them. There was, an absence of these things that influencers now get in 2022, 2023. So I think the barrier to entry, if you were someone on social media in 2009, you had to like it. You had to enjoy doing it just to do it. Because even if you popped up, even if you had a massive channel, you had 5,000 subscribers. In terms of monetary compensation, it wasn't there. So I guess the question I'm wondering in general, and I want to move past that, is, the environment changed by allowing more opportunities to incentivize people to participate. Those same people that did it for a particular reason, well, now when you're given, different circumstances and those different opportunities, how would one act in that new environment? And I wonder, I do think for some of those people, maybe it would change a little bit. I do want to then circle back though, Laurin, to your point about question, why do people choose this division versus that division? Let's contextualize this then. What is the most popular women's division? And like in terms of monetary compensation, because we're now talking about we're on the precipice of discussing some of these issues within, let's say, like women's bikini that you've experienced or you've seen, or just the state of the industry. But help us understand this space where you said you competed a decade ago. Has it grown a lot? Like in terms of that monetary compensation, you don't have to discuss specifics, but has that grown? How does it compare to other women's divisions? Like, just help us understand maybe the space before we dive into it, because I think there's a lot of different moving parts. I think the background noise, so to speak, would be social media, and that's why we talk about the pressure to remain relevant. But help us just understand the space a little bit, so then we can understand the answers.
Absolutely. Bikini is the largest division, hands down. I don't have numbers. I really do not know in terms of numbers, like what the differences would be amongst show to show or just in general, amongst the NPC or IFBB, but hands down, bikini is the largest division. I don't know if that's the same in natural bodybuilding. I don't think that it is, but it might be.
It is.
I know that it wasn't, before, but now again, clearly, I think that has shifted. So yes, hands down, bikini is the largest, and the larger shows, I will say, have gotten better in terms of compensation. There's always been a large financial incentive for, let's say male bodybuilders to win the Olympia. Like I can't remember, is it like 400 grand? It's something pretty substantial for the Olympia for the men's bodybuilding. Outside of that, and even the other male shows are really not that large of like purse money. Do you know what I mean? And the same goes for really all of the female divisions as well. There's really not a huge financial compensation. I would say, though, that the Olympia and the Arnold, from the last that I checked, have gotten more financially incentivized for bikini. Again, I haven't caught up with the other ones because it's really irrelevant to me. But
Sure.
Yes, there definitely is more prize money there. But it's definitely like, even if you are winning like every show, you really are not making your money through that. I would say that if you are in the top handful of IFBB athletes, and even some of the, like, not to say that NPC athletes don't make this money either, because there certainly are NPC athletes who also have other just brand deals who are absolutely killing it, because as we all know, the space has changed, right? Like previously, it used to be like, you're sponsored by this company, they pay you a salary, you have to go to every expo, you do this. Like that was a really big thing back then. Now that's not really a thing, right? Now it's more like the girl who just has a great butt, and this is not me talking down on any way of this, but a girl who has like just a great butt, great look, who's never competed, who just works out and shares stuff, like she might work with a company, a clothing apparel company, and make more money than any like athlete might, right? So social media and influencer marketing has completely changed the game. So I would say that if you are looking to be a professional athlete in the space, the monetary incentive is really not there from a competing perspective. However, again, if you're thinking in terms of like you're, one of the top 10, let's say, athletes, you're going to have more access to potential sponsorship deals because that just makes sense. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But that's not to say that the person who just doesn't have a great physique online, who's never competed, doesn't make more with what they're doing, because that's also very relevant and very true. So it's super interesting now because it is very different. But yes, bikini is the largest. And I would say that the money has increased, but the sponsorships are just different than they used to be. Like I used to, work with different companies. I used to work with a company that they would sell like every company, right? Like what's the name of that? Like they sold every brand, right? Of like, it wasn't just one. It wasn't like I work with like it's not just First Form, right? It was like they sold First Form and Extreme Nutrition and Gaspari and this
umbrella company.
Yeah, like an umbrella company, right? And so I used to work for them, and I would do different like demo work for different companies, and I would whatever event or whatever they needed me at, and I would you'd see, okay, the big the big athletes for Gaspari would they're at every event, you know what I mean, because they have a big contract for like, this is what you get per stipend, and it wasn't social media related or reach related. It was, you're going to be at these places related, right? And that was part of your contract. And obviously part of that was, okay, how are, we'll cover part of your shows. How are you doing, et cetera, et cetera. So now I think the space is just very different because, 10 years ago, it used to be based off of that. And now it's just the online influencer marketing has completely changed everything, even for those types of companies.
Right.
Like those. So because it's not looking as much, they're looking at like the overall reach versus like who's going to be at this event. So it's very different. Like when you really think about it.
Yeah, and just to give some numbers, so I just looked up the Olympia 2021 prize money.
Okay.
So the Mr. Olympia, like you said, $400,000.
Okay, that's what I thought.
One. Number 2, 150. Number 3, 100. Then it drops down 45 for number 4th, and then 40 grand for 5th place. The 212, first place is 50K.
Yeah,
so
big
it's
difference.
1/8 of if you win the Mr. Olympia in the open division, and it drops off all the way down to 3K for 5th. Miss Olympia, so that's female bodybuilding, similar to the 212. It's exactly the same numbers: 50, 20, 10, 5, 4. Men's physique, also very similar: 50, 15, and 10 for the top 3.
Okay.
So even though this is something that's probably more marketable, you're not actually making money.
And classic. I mean, Sivam, like he's arguably one of the most popular competitors, right?
On the men's side, right?
I'd say
like,
the most
easily.
Yeah.
And
50K. So so classic. So it's interesting how the rewards for the athletes in the actual top competition don't reflect necessarily the popularity of the division currently. Chris Bumstead won 50K by winning the Classic Physique Olympia, and then drops off 15, 10, 3, 2. Bikini, same numbers: 50, 20, 12, 5, 4 for the top 5.
Yeah. And that is, so anybody listening, the Olympia is the largest competition of the year. I would say that the Arnold Classic is going to be probably the second largest one in terms of notoriety and prize money and all that. There's other Arnold shows that are just typically a little bit smaller. I'm not familiar with the prize money there. But just like the average show that you might be competing in, I mean, it's quite a bit less.
A quarter of that.
Much less. Yeah. So the idea of, people talk about like competing for prize money is probably not going to be substantial enough to make a living.
Unless
However,
you're top 3 in the men's open division.
However, if you have the the ability to be in that top group, or you could be pretty close, and you have these other brand deals and sponsorships and companies that you can work with, or also just leveraging that, like, all right, I'm going to offer posing some. I know a lot of people who will go and travel, and they'll offer seminars and new things. So if you're in that top place, like you can certainly make a living there, but it might not just be directly from those sources anymore. And like I said, it's just really interesting now that I'm reflecting as we're having the conversation on the differences that it used to be when you had a sponsorship, so to speak, versus now what most brand deals, would say, or most commission-based things. I mean, like I said, I know people who are absolutely killing it with the commission with working with different companies who have never stepped foot on stage. They have amazing physiques, and they probably could if they wanted to, but like they don't. But they're making substantially more than maybe a old school kind of traditional sponsorship would have been. So definitely interesting.
There are so many thoughts I have when it comes to the influencer marketing side, because that's what I've been working on the last several years. Eric, do you want to go down that path or dive right into the problems? Because we could totally sidestep that. But I think that's a fascinating topic maybe for later. Where do you want to go, Eric? That, or let's get into the problems within the division?
Good question. I think there are some universals maybe we could touch on first. And whether you want to be the person who is stepping on stage or not and making money, even though currently competing is optional, it seems like. I think the pressure in either way is you need to stay, especially probably even more so for a non-competitor, is you need to be in shape all the time, or you need to appear like you're in shape all the time at least. And that is something that is potentially a problem for people's health. And more so than the individual influencers, it gives an unsustainable message to people who are consuming fitness content.
Yes. And that even used to be different, because think about before when, like, let's say it was more through either, blogs or like magazines or things like that, right? Like you would have someone who would, a competitor would diet down. They would do a bunch of photo shoots. They'd have a ton of photos, and they'd be able to use those, right? Or maybe even in the early days of social media. Now, you can't really hide. Like you can wear clothes that are more flattering, maybe for a certain physique that you have, but like you're not really going to be able to hide kind of what you look like if you're someone who is consistently showing up. And if we're talking about people who are using this in some kind of way for like to make a living, like you have to be doing that. You know what I mean? And that pressure there is so much different than like, oh, I can just stockpile some photos and reshare them. Because the reality is like people are expecting, which is also a funny thing in and of itself for social media. People are expecting to see current relatable things. They're expecting you to go on your story and to talk. They're expecting you to post something like a training reel, right? And like, there's only so many things that you can recycle before people are going to, so like there is like this interesting pressure that is so different than it used to be, especially for people who do compete, right? But just for everybody, because now as we've discussed, this is completely blown up in a different direction. And competing, competing is optional, like absolutely, because and even with a lot of these deals, like a lot of the deals, and I can't speak for myself personally because I never had a contract like this, but like there were certainly probably contracts, and I would imagine back in the day, again, I think 10 years ago, where if you had a contract with a company, like you probably had to place a certain way, or at least maintain certain placings or incentivize to place a certain way. Now, like companies probably don't care, like, oh, you're selling 30 grand of our leggings. Like we don't really give a fuck if you place or not. You know what I mean? Like we'll support you, but like that doesn't really change. Like you can still document all that. You're still getting the content out there. But like most people also don't really, like, they're not like, oh my God, you didn't win. Like, they're just there to support you. So it's like, it is interesting how it's kind of like this optional thing almost.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of gold there, Omar. And I think we should go down that. So I think actually kind of briefly, because I think there's more there, let's talk about some of the issues that competitors specifically face. For those who remember, we had a couple episodes, no, more than a couple episodes on the Washington Post articles that came out about some of the, I'll just say corruption to kind of cast a broad umbrella.
Fair.
Sometimes certain people in positions of power trying to successfully or unsuccessfully influence judging, and just kind of a culture of, I would say, politics. The need to try to do things to influence your placings that went beyond just simply being an athlete and showing up on stage. Mm-hmm. It seems to me, and I, again, not as a bikini competitor, not involved in that space, that whether it's the subjective nature of it, whether it's the modeling thing or whatever, but the culture around, especially in IFBB and NPC, of being a bikini competitor, it seems to encourage more things related to buying into the social ecosystem and being known, being relevant, the judges knowing your face, being seen. And I don't think it's overt like, hey, you need to go do things. Maybe it is sometimes, but I don't think it's generally overt that, hey, you need to do things that are influence the judges to place you higher. But it seems like this kind of mildly concerning culture that I have observed as a coach and just in the space, even as a male competitor, you see it of, wow, like this division, like they're doing a lot, and like they have teams and they have to meet with people and their shoots. Can you speak to that a little bit? Because it seems like it's not a good environment for competitors, in my opinion, if they're looking to have a sporting environment where this is fair play, and yes, it's subjective, but at least we're all going and doing the same thing and being evaluated by the same criteria to the best capability of a fallible judge.
I don't know why bikini has become I don't know what is like the driving force behind bikini being really like the only division that this matters so much, right? Not saying that these large teams don't have a handful of other athletes, right? Like it's not that, but when you think of the teams, right? Like we, like, when people say like they, it's like the teams is like kind of like there are quotes, right? Like who are they? We don't know.
Yeah.
Like the teams, it's largely bikini driven, right? Again, there's going to be other athletes on those clients' roster, but you're not seeing a whole team of like male bodybuilders all coached by the same person. You're not seeing teams of physique clients, right? Like you're just not. And I don't know if that is the personalities that are drawn to the bikini division, because it's not just what someone's body looks. It's not just like the physique differences. There has to be a marked difference in someone's personality as to why they would be driven towards something like that, right? So I don't just think that it's physique driven or marketability driven. I think part of it is just numbers, right? Like there's a bias of numbers. There's just simply more bikini athletes. So it's just going to be more people on those teams. But there is this like weird overhanging like outlook of, well, if I want to do well, I need to be on this team and I need to have this group of people with me and all this, which is so interesting because the reason that I got into bodybuilding, the reason that I love bodybuilding is that it is an individual thing. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't have a support system with your coach, primarily your family, your friends, your spouse, other people in the gym. Like there is certainly an environment of like in a culture of friendship and shared experience, because there's some people just don't get it, until they've done it and they're like, oh, I can, I'm relating to this person, right? So I'm not saying you don't have a support system, but I never once was like, oh, let me go backstage and I really hope that I have 30 other people here with me. I can't wait to check in and wait in line so that my coach can look at me for 3 seconds and that it's like this weird, it's almost like a sorority. That's what it feels like. It feels like a sorority. And I'm like, I personally, that's not my personality. Never been drawn to that. I've never worked with a coach who's been like that. I probably wouldn't, or if I did, I probably wouldn't partake in those things. And it's not a type of relationship that I foster amongst our clients. You know what I mean? Like I said, the clients who are coming to work with me or any of the coaches on our team are doing so because they want a certain type of coaching and a certain type of coaching relationship. Anything else outside of that is a bonus if I'm there or not. The premise isn't there's going to be a million other people here and we're going to have this whole environment. But it's interesting that a lot of people who are drawn to this feel like they can't compete unless there is this team nature. And and I'm just like
make noise on the mic.
Sorry. I always get mad when I'm recording my podcast and they're like the elbow and I'm like, and then I just did
that.
No,
You're good. You're good.
Sorry. I got a little intense. It's so interesting. Like people think that they cannot be successful without this, or they just think that it's the norm that they have to do that, and for whatever reason. And this is not new, right? We've talked about a lot of things that have changed over time. This is the exact same thing that's been happening since I started competing. This has been, now I wasn't aware of it when I first started, like in 2011, because I was not in the bikini scene, and bikini was so new. But in 2013 and on, there's always been the teams. There's always been the big groups. And I don't know what is the there's obviously some personality reasons why certain people are being drawn towards this. And it's very interesting. And I'm like, shouldn't we be trying to have the best coaching possible for you and like your experience? Because a lot of times, and this is not always, right? This is not always, but there are certainly a lot of times that people come back after these experiences and they share that they were not getting attention that they needed or that they wanted. They felt like they were just a number. They felt like there was people who were getting more than they were, right? Which could be their own perception, certainly. But again, that kind of just goes back to this like sorority idea. There's like the favorites, there's this, it's cliquey. And I'm like, why? I don't know why people are seeking that. It's very strange.
I think the coaches do it a little bit too. Like the coaches of those types of teams, they actually like solicit athletes in a way that is very different from the way, like it's more active and less passive, Omar. So I'll tell you a legit story. There's a trainer I know. I'm not going to give any more information than that because it could get back to the person. But the line they actually use, it's Ronnie Conlin. No. So this trainer at a gym went up to someone who they thought could be a successful bikini competitor. And basically started spitting game to them like you would think of them like being like a pimp. And one of the actual things they said to this woman was, "I can make you a star, girl." Like that to me, like, are we a sports coach?
Yeah.
Or do I need to attend a player's ball? I don't know. Like, what's happening here?
Well, what that does though is when, like, so say someone gets a few high-level athletes, that's how that trickle effect happens, right? And that's how a lot of these teams continue to say, because you go, I've heard one good thing to 25 bad things about this coach. How the fuck does this person still have an enormous business, right? And I can think of a million people off the top of my head, right?
Yes.
But what happens is you have the superstar effect, right? Where someone brings in a handful of really, really great people, or they get them to a position to where they look really great. And that then attracts this person thinking that if they got it for this girl, they can do that for me too.
Yep.
Right. And again, that could be a intersection of both the coach kind of of creating that story, that narrative, and also just that individual who's like, oh, I want to be that, and they can. That's what's weird. But this is where I don't understand this disconnect is I can look at someone and go, wow, like that's amazing. Like what that coach and that athlete did together. They, they really made all these changes together. They have a phenomenal physique. They, made all this stuff, right? I don't look at that and go, oh, that coach can definitely get that for me. I look at that and go, oh, that coach did a great job with that client. Maybe they could help me there, but I'm not like, there's like this huge jumping off point that a lot of people go blindly, even knowing information of, oh, well, maybe this person does this, or I don't know, but they got that person there. So I'm just going to go to that. And the coaches, some of the coaches do leverage that, they leverage their superstars. And it's like, just because you got this person, these results doesn't necessarily mean that that's how they're going to get you there. And and you can typically tell that when all they do is share those superstar people, and then they're just like, oh, look at this person. It's kind of like this, like show, like the first in show pony, you know what I mean? Like, here's this person. And then there's like that idea of like, well, oh, they can get me there. Not the, how did I coach this person to get here? Just the showing of the end result.
Yeah. And another thing, and you don't have to name any names, and honestly, we're not the ones doing it. We're reporting on a reporter. Like, they specifically in the Washington Post article, they brought up how Team Bombshell had reportedly had some of their athletes specifically say, they told them, hey, go see this judge and do something. It'll help you. So the idea that these teams are sometimes, and I'm absolutely not throwing shade at all the teams, I'm sure there's some great ones out there, but some of the relatively prominent teams, they are using the fact that they have a large stable of athletes, which is something that means that the organization, IFBB, the NPC, oh, you're bringing 30 people to my show. That's a good thing automatically. So there's a risk of bias when nothing is done. But then on top of that, there are these reports of the coaches or the staff being involved with these teams and telling the competitors, hey, I want you to go specifically do this. This person you want to impress. This person blatantly, in that one example, I want you to give a sexual favor to. And that might help things competitively. So it's not like it's just in all cases, like, let's get a group of competitors together and create this thing. And it's almost like this group-based influence of trying to, I wonder if the competitors, whether they actually realize it or they're thinking about it, like, you know what, I want to be part of that team because they just seem to generally do better. They kind of know people,
Yeah, I don't know what, like, there's definitely, like I said, there has to be some kind of a handful of personality drivers as to why people would choose to work with certain teams, right? Amidst hearing, some mixed reviews, right? And there's, we've been coaching for a very long time. There are some athletes who just aren't going to click with you, right? No matter what, like, you're just going to see things differently. You're not going to have a great relationship. So there's always going to be people who are like, oh, I work with this person and I love them. I work with this person and I didn't like them, right? That's understood. You can't please everybody. If any coaches are listening, like, you're not every client is going to be like, you guys are going to have this best relationship, right? However, there is a difference when, oh, we maybe saw things differently, or this didn't really work out, or I kind of wanted this a little bit, versus consistently saying the same thing over and over again. Like, when you hear, if I were to be like, oh yeah, like I said, Omar, and every single person says, oh, Omar does this. And you're like, oh wow, like, I don't even know this person, right? But like, all I hear are these same reports about the same thing over and over again. Why would someone choose to go work with that company? Do you know what I mean? And it's very interesting. So there has to be a handful of reasons. And this is related, kind of tangent, but still related, is a lot of people, when they get into competing, and again, especially I find this more with bikini, is they end up like, they put everything else to the side, and then they start tying their worth to how they're looking and their placings, and maybe the brands that they start working with, or the eyes that they're getting, or the content, whatever it might be. Like, there's all this there's this intertwining of self-worth and confidence with like how I look and how I place. And again, because there's still this notion, which is false, which we talked about in the beginning, but there's still this notion that bikini is the easiest division and I can just get leaner. I'm pretty much there. This is like always swelling in the background. So then that ties back into the like always needing to be relevant and always needing to compete. And then it just fuels each other in this really, really sad way. And that's why I think a lot of people end up not competing for the long term, right? It's because they are getting like chewed up and spit out by constantly competing and or staying too lean for comparative reasons. And then they're just like, I just can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like there's just like this fallout moment where you're like, I can't fucking do this anymore. And that's really unfortunate because that is where it's like, well, you know, if you don't want to compete anymore because it's not in line with what you want to do, then that's fine. But if you feel like you can't do it anymore because of these standards that you've created for yourself, or that other people have made you feel that you need to do, right? Whether it's the coaches or the companies you're working with or whatever it might be, that's really unfortunate. Like I've chose to not compete anymore. Partly because I was pretty burned out, I'll be honest. Like at the end of my last season, I was like, I'm done for a minute. Like I don't know when, but I'm done. And I'm definitely in a very regulated, healthy place now that like if I wanted to compete, I feel like there would be a lot less, we'll use the word damage in loose terms, but a lot less physiological and psychological damage, potentially. I don't know. But it's just not really in line with what I want to be doing right now, right? I know that there's a substantial effort that I would have to put in before and during that I'm just not really too keen to do. Like, you know, like I am enjoying, like, this is a perfect example of like, I get to go travel here and like, you know what, if I miss some meals or I miss a gym session, you know, like it's okay. You know, my work is most important. My experiences are most important. And then obviously training and being healthy are like important to me as well. But there's just a different level, right, that's required. And that's where it's like, I've made that decision, but I'm not in a place where I'm like, oh, I fucking hate the industry and I'm so burned out and I can't compete. But that's where a lot of people find themselves. And that's what I just is really sad. And I wish people could exit because they wanted to, not because they feel like they have to, because they can't keep up with something that's unsustainable.
How much of that do you think is somewhat related to the inability of bikini competitors, or I should say, it being harder for bikini competitors to separate their self-worth, their attractiveness, or their sense of personal beauty from their physique as a competitor and what they have to do to maintain it? Because speaking for myself, it's like, yeah, being more muscular is becoming more and more and more popularized in our society. Like if you look at the progression of Luke or superheroes, Luke Skywalker is a toy, or just male images. Like Luke who?
Wait, Luke here?
So
You don't know our boy Luke?
Yeah.
I mean, I do, but I wasn't that'd be rad.
So, but essentially like the...
like a lightsaber just like goes... Sorry, okay.
Exactly. But like, for example, the toys of Luke Skywalker, tiny waist, broad shoulders now. It wasn't that way in the 70s. And even in the last 10 years, just the way social media has changed for men, the pressure is becoming more like it is and has been for women. Maybe because I'm 40 and I got into bodybuilding at a time where Instagram wasn't a thing. But for me, pursuing bodybuilding was counterculture rather than enhancing a current pressure or look. So I wonder, is it just inherently easier for me to go like, me looking awesome on stage has very little to do with me feeling attractive or me having self-worth? Do you think it's on average harder for bikini competitors to separate those two things? So competing every year becomes this thing of like, you're getting rewarded. Like for example, judges don't tell me, oh, you look beautiful, you know, like, oh, you're so pretty up there, anything like that.
Yeah. And that is legitimate feedback in terms of, and because partly it is important, right? Like, oh, like, wow, like you absolutely nailed your look. Like your hair and makeup looked flawless. Like you're like you really stood out there. And like, it's hard almost to separate those things, especially in bikini, because it is a part of it. Right. I don't know if it, and I think it's probably both. I think it's probably a combination of both, that there's a self-selecting process of people who are drawn towards this, who maybe are trying to seek their worth from external systems, right? Whether that is something like a social media or a placing or the validation of a team or the, you know, whether real or perceived group environment, whatever that might be. I think there's going to be there's just people who are self-selecting for that, right? Or coming into this. And then I think there's also just people who maybe were kind of neutral coming into it. And then the incessant repetitive nature of it over 3, 4, 5, 6 years has then changed that for them, right? So I think it's probably a combination of both. And, you know, a lot of people, as we know, you wrote a great paper on this, and I'm sure talked about it a million times on here with other guests as well. Like, there are just certain personality types that are going to be drawn, traditionally speaking, to something like a bodybuilding. You know, you're going to be a little bit more borderline neurotic, if not fully blown more highly neurotic, right? You're going to be type A personality. You're going to be very disciplined, very rigid. And some of those things you're going to need to be a successful bodybuilder, right? I'm not going to sit here and say that you don't need to care, you know, like you do. But as we've discussed, there's different layers to it, right? Like eventually, hopefully you can become less like that to be successful. However, I do think when people are first starting, they do need to be a lot more disciplined and a lot more rigid. It's just kind of, you have to go through that process. But in any case, I think there's a self-selecting process, that there's people who are more drawn to it, who have a certain personality type, certain proclivities, right? It's very attractive to be like, oh, like this kind of fits already how I think. And other people are like this too. Like, okay, yeah, cool. Like, let me dive into this, you know? But then I think that for a lot of people, even people who are kind of neutral baseline coming into it, the more that you do it, it kind of just does wear you down, you know, like no matter what, like there, and this is even just social media in general, right? Like I have clients who will really struggle like so badly with just, you know, the comparison of, you know, seeing other people. And what's really hard about it is because you're comparing yourself to people who don't have a life that you have, nor are you seeking to have that life. So if you're looking at someone who's like head to head doing what you're doing and you're comparing yourself, that's different than looking at someone who has a completely different life, completely different objectives, and completely different goals, and then comparing yourself, right? Like, you're always going to be unsatisfied if that's what you're comparing to, right? And this is not even talking about like what people share or don't share on social media. I'm just talking like legitimately. And I've done this too. Like, there's plenty of times where I'll see people and I'm like, oh my gosh, they're killing it and they're doing this. Like, why am I not doing that? And then I'm like, hold on. Are you even trying to do that? Like, that's not what you even want to be doing. So why are you even like remotely upset over this? You know, like if we were doing the same thing, then I could look at, okay, what are they doing that I'm not doing? What could I be doing differently? And compare head to head. But a lot of people are not doing that, especially in the social media landscape. So um, I feel like it's probably both. I feel like it's probably people who are coming in are self-selected to have certain personality types, be drawn to certain aspects of it. But then I do think for a large portion of people, they just kind of get sucked into it because that becomes the lens that you start viewing yourself, because it's really hard to not, especially if you don't have an anchor, like especially if you are, you know, younger and you haven't really had a lot of like self-exploration time. Maybe you don't have a, you know, someone who's grounding in your life, like a partner or other friends who are outside of this, you know, like it's really easy just to be like, oh my gosh, whoa, like who am I now? You know, right? And that can happen for a lot of people no matter what they're doing, but especially if you are entering something that is so intense like this. So
Makes a lot of sense. I appreciate that insight.
No, that is disappointing to hear that some of what you just shared kind of corroborates in ways what the Washington Post series was talking about. Desmond Butler, you know, they specifically talking about abuses from people in positions of power. Sometimes a culture of conformity is what you're saying. Where it's like, who are they, and like, why are
yeah,
people incentivized? And when you said, what I like when you said it's like a self-selecting process where over time an environment will morph and help dictate the behavior of the participants by rewarding them for certain things. And so it will actively encourage certain types of people to participate, while also then by extension being almost exclusionary for other people that maybe see what the environment's like, or get that feedback loop where they hear from other people, oh, this is like, if you want to compete in a bikini, this is what it's like in 2023. Do I want to do that? And so over time, it gradually morphs into what certainly sounds like almost like a culture of conformity, but also that predatory aspect, Eric, that you said about the coaching, you know, which is super like I can make you a star. I'm like, am I reading Iceberg Slim right now? Yeah, it's so there's so many different facets to go down. Maybe Laurin, from someone who's participated in the space now for, you know, a decade, if you had a magic wand, if you could start taking a look from the inside out, and now you're analyzing and you think, okay, like these things, I wish they could be changed. Where would that start? Like, where would you start? Where do you think it begins, and what would need to happen? And also, maybe what's feasible? Because again, we encourage people separate conversation, but parallel. The series, the Washington Post, about the corruption within the IFBB, just in general. But what do you think needs to change, and what could feasibly maybe change? Like, what would be the next logical steps if people actually wanted to follow through with this?
I think it purely starts with the athletes, and that's it. Because if all the athletes decided to make changes, then the coaches and the industry as a whole would have to make changes, because then nobody would be making money if they weren't, you know what I mean? Like if everybody else wasn't changing with the times, then they would be out of business, right? So I think that this all starts with the athletes putting themselves in a position to where they go into this knowing everything. They're very informed of the good, the bad, the ugly, not just in terms of like how they might potentially feel about getting on stage, but also just like what are the realities of getting this lean? How are you going to feel? What's the time that actually this is going to take, right? I think if people started arming themselves more with this information and this outlook, then we would have and you not only arm yourself with this information, but then also stick with it, right? And say, okay, now I know, but not going, I know, but I could do it differently, right? Like actually knowing, okay, this is what it would really take. Then in holding firm with that and saying, no, I'm only going to operate within this frame of thinking and reasoning, and that's going to decide all of my decisions. And doing a lot of their own, again, kind of personal inner work, knowing, okay, my worth is not determined by this placing. And if you're strong in that, then you'll be able to withstand the pressures of having to compete all the time, withstand the pressures of, oh, I'll just do a 12-week prep when I haven't done anything beforehand, withstanding the pressures of, oh, I feel like I need to keep up with this and that. And if you change your inner workings, then all of everything else is going to have to change. It's not going to be overnight, but I think that even if there were changes with a few teams or a few promoters or even things like that, like it's not going to matter if there's droves of athletes who are driving it to be how it currently is. So I think that it really just comes down to the individuals arming themselves with the information, being realistic with timelines in terms of how long this is going to take to prep. What do I want to get out of this, right? I'll get these, potential client calls and, I think I want to compete and this and that, but I don't know if I want to lose my cycle. I'm like, all right, well, I can't promise that. I have some clients who compete who maintain a cycle because they're naturally leaner and they can maintain a cycle very lean. I have some overweight clients who lose a little bit of weight, and because they're adjusting back down to a normal body composition, they lose their cycle and they're not lean enough, right? Like we're not even close to competition lean. That is a potential that you might be facing. Are you okay with that? If you're not, then this is a hard no. Only you can decide that, right? So I think that it's just important knowing all the facets beforehand, staying firm with that. And then if you want to update and make decisions, then you can. But it's just one of those things that you have to go in with that knowledge and just be firm with it. And I think that that's the only way that any of this is going to change over time, because if there's, like I said, droves of athletes who just don't care and are continuing the system forward, it doesn't matter who else changes, because that's what's driving it.
Omar, it sounds like in this case, identifying the problem is pretty close to actually solving it. Because while that's not normally the case and people can point out issues without actually having any viable solution, it sounds like part of the issue, and Laurin, correct me if you think I'm off base here, is that a lot of competitors these days don't necessarily know the good, the bad, and the ugly. And they're going into it with different expectations than what's real. And I think maybe they're putting a little too much stock into what Iceberg Slim says to them in the gym, or they're putting a little too much stock into like that top athlete. And instead, hopefully, we can have people be a little more open and transparent about what's going on. So things like the Washington Post article is probably good, so you can see the ugly. And then these types of conversations, which we're having now on Iron Culture with IFBB Pro Bikini competitor Laurin Conlin about the good and the bad to complement that, I think are perhaps the largest service we can do, because in the end, this is not high school soccer. You know what I'm saying? This isn't Pee Wee League baseball or football. This is adults who've been lifting weights for sometimes only 6 months, but sometimes 6 years. Who are going, you know what? I would like to actually diet down and get in front of a panel of 7 judges to critique my nearly naked physique and try to do something with that. And I think you just, if we're talking about adults opting into a niche sport that also, let's be honest, is kind of ironclad gripped by a small number of people in power, I think you're right. The most feasible thing that we can do is make sure that you know what you're getting into and that you can take care of yourself when you're in that position.
Yeah, and I think that, everybody goes into certain things and, makes mistakes. And this is not saying that, or your first show, you need to have a whole thesis written on everything. Like, I'm not saying like that, but to your point, like that example of someone coming up. So say you're just been training, right? And this is just a common example. You've been training, you look pretty good. Someone comes up to you, hey, I could make you a star. And they don't share anything. Like, hey, maybe. A dull star.
I think like a red dwarf.
Yeah. A dying star. They didn't mention that part.
Right.
But they say that and they're just like, yeah, we could get you. Well, what does that look like? Oh, well, I have a team of other girls at the gym. You can talk to them, get on stage 12, get you ready in 12 weeks. Who's going to say no to that? Right. Like that sounds interesting. Like that doesn't sound like it's anything insidious because it's not. It's not until it is, right? Until, oh, okay, well, you did pretty good. Well, let's just do this again. And then, well, now I'm kind of not feeling so great. Your coach doesn't answer you. Hey, I want to compete again. Oh, okay. And then you get back on the same plan and then you continue to do like, this is so common. And then that's when people get chewed up and spit out by this because they weren't aware of everything. So it seems really glitzy. It seems really glamorous because it is and like the end product. But, and a lot of times people will they used to think that I was trying to be super negative about the industry. And I'm like, I'm not being like, honestly, I do believe that it's people driven. It's athlete driven. So there's issues with every single corporation, federation, group. There's always going to be like dynamics that are out of your control when you're doing something that's not just on your own, and you have to conform by certain rules. That's just everything in the entire world, and I have no issues with that because it's a personal decision. Like this isn't something that nobody is forcing anyone to do a bodybuilding show. Like not one person, you know what I mean? Like you are solely making that decision. But what upsets me is that people just don't arm themselves with this information. And then they blame the sport. Like this is not bodybuilding's fault at all. Like this was your fault for not choosing to hear other sides of this, for not taking your time. So like, hey, but the cool message is you can come back from this. You know what I mean? Like you're not broken. You're not damaged. Like anything that you've been through hormonally, physiologically, psychologically, like people have come out of on the other side, and it's really, really important to understand that too. So if you're listening and you're like, I'm that person who's been like chewed up and spit out and I don't know what to do, like, trust me, I've been there. I've worked with so many clients. Like, to be honest, like that's more of who I work with now. People who are not sure if they want to compete again or transitioning away to a more normal life, right? And I'm happy that I can be that kind of bridge for them because I understand what this is like. And it's this very delicate thing. There's a lot that we have to balance, but people do get through this. And it's not something that is like, oh, I did a few shows and now I'm fucked up forever. Like, no, it's going to be a bumpy ride. It's not going to be easy, but we're going to be able to correct these behaviors and these patterns and get you back to a place where you're thriving.
I mean, the ride, maybe the plane, we might even say, might experience a little bit of turbulence. It might be pitch dark for, 16 hours. It might feel like purgatory. But when you land in the beautiful town, the seaside coastal town of Innsmouth, and all the citizens, all the villagers look kind of almost aquatic-like, and they're all murmuring about some sort of old god that you can't quite comprehend. Don't be scared. Okay, don't be scared. I will say that I think, Laurin, to your point, what you do, sharing your information, things like the Washington Post series will help arm people to make a better informed choice. And I think the missing aspect here with any asymmetric system where you simply don't know enough, you don't know what the potential end outcome will be, you don't know what the environment's like. If someone can be descriptive from the inside where you have that experiential knowledge to then, 1, 2, 3, 4, this is what it's like, people can make a better choice. And I think that's certainly a powerful first step. I also think not just there, but shout out to the corrupted players at the top. They gots to go. I'm not involved in this whatsoever, but specifically from the Washington Post article series, because if you have a figurehead at that place, I'll give a side story that's completely relevant, but I'm not a fan of UFC president Dana White for many different reasons. He has so many different things to get into, but he doesn't fairly compensate his fighters. There's so many different things. I don't know where you want to begin. But to your point, Laurin, some people, we talk about participants here, unionizing. So let's say unionizing individuals. Many fighters wanted to do that, and then they try to approach it. Things wouldn't work, and then they're essentially let go. So for essentially standing up and trying to vocalize some of these issues and rally people together to have then a larger bargaining power, they were released. So obviously, hopefully it's not similar to that where you can not only make the choice for yourself, but then you can also participate and help create the culture that you want to see. And that it's not something like, let's say, Laurin, like you're like, you know what, I'm going to participate, or my team, like who's the team? My team now is going to participate. They. And then people are like, no, you can't do that. Like, making this content. Like, I guess my question for you, based off of that, have you experienced any pushback? You kind of just said that some people, their perception of you or the way you talk about it is that you're kind of negative when it comes to the space. Have you experienced any pushback, maybe from, in quotations, industry insiders who don't want you to say these things? I'm just wondering in terms of
Yeah.
the fluidity of being able to vocalize what you want without any like negative social media ramifications. Where not that you're like blacklisted or whatever, but like Laurin spoke up. Now she's not invited to the dinner. She's not invited to the barbecue. Her name is not is spoken in these hallowed halls. Like, well, what does it feel like?
So I was never in a position that, just to be frank, it would have ever mattered, right? Like I'm not one of the theys, I
Yeah.
was never someone who had this like huge, large presence. So it wasn't like that it necessarily affected me in that sense. And I do a pretty good job, I think, of being very balanced with my approach. So I don't try to like, I think everybody has their own, especially in this, right? Like a little bit different. Like I understand the parallel, right, with the UFC, but like I'm not getting a salary from this directly. Do you know what I mean? And neither are the athletes, right? So it's like, if you like the way that you decide to make a change is by either arming yourself with the information and still doing it, or just not doing it, right? So it's like there is the free choice is 100% there if you want to do it or not do it. And yeah, I've never really had any ramifications in that sense because I'm not out here. I think a lot of people, when they try to bring these things up, they do so in a way that's not balanced, and then just trying to like talk shit. And I'm like, I have nothing to talk shit about. You know what I mean? Like I'm just like, here's the facts, and I just try to put the onus on each individual person, which I think is much more empowering instead of putting it on, well, you can't do this because of that person. It's like, okay, well, how am I going to make a way forward then? Okay, but what can I change? I can change this. Okay, cool. That is empowering. So I can make these decisions or not make these decisions. So I've never really faced that, but I also, again, wasn't one of these people that was like invited to the dinners to then not be invited, so so the proverbial dinner. So it's just one of those things that I when I was competing more heavily, and then I kind of stepped back and shared some of those reasons. Some people would say that it was a little bit more negative, but I'm like, if you know me, you know that I'm very comfortable speaking about things that some people would consider dark and ominous and negative, and it's just not to me. It's just I look at things as like, this is how they are. It just is, not a good or bad. I'm not labeling it as good or bad, but I just have I would consider a more realistic view of certain things. So if you want to call that negative, you can, but I'm not just going to sit here and not share some of the potential things that could be harmful for someone. And that goes for everything. I'm pretty public about how I feel about social media in general. My positions on that in general, in terms of, I'm not like, I'm not calling out Mark Zuckerberg every day and being like, oh, fuck this guy. I'm not, that's, like, that's not what I'm saying. But it's like, I'm trying to inform people, like, listen, this is how, like, this is trying to hijack this. This is here. Like, even if you know all this information about it, you could still fall into this. And I'm very open and vocal about the detriments that can have on us individually and just kind of society. And I'm not looking at that as a negative thing. It's just, again, it just is. It's here. You have to learn how to deal with it. So it might as well have people who are willing to have a open dialogue about it, in my opinion. So,
Omar, let me ask you this, to use your interview line, which I love. You said you have a lot of thoughts on the influencer side of things, and I think there's a lot of parallels. I wonder if we could use our last few minutes here for you to talk about how that space has changed, the pressures on influencers, and how, because we've had this conversation before, it's one thing to be empowered and to be kind of Machiavellian about your social media use, and like, you know what, I have a good physique, I want to make some money, I'm my own personal brand, I got social media, I'm empowered, I'm going to do this. But you shared with me that you sometimes think that social media influencers don't realize how much they're getting played without even realizing it, and how the things are influencing them, and how they become progressively less maybe the one behind the driver's seat, and they find themselves in this kind of self-driving car in the backseat, and it's a Tesla and it's going to explode because that's what they do apparently these days.
I do.
Because Elon Musk is a supervillain, and his last name, once again, he changed it from Mollusk to Musk. It's so strange, but no, Eric, we have we have 8 minutes. I'm aware of your time. We'll get into it.
Give me the power 7.
The power 7. You got it. So social media is very interesting. I think, Laurin, to your point, there's a lot of parallels that you can draw here. And I almost would relate it, not quite, but let's say to the obesity epidemic, which sounds like, what are you talking about here? Well, that's multifactorial. It seems like it's a seemingly simple issue, right, to outsiders. Oh, like you're overweight, you need to eat less food. Without respect to the environment, like the person participating in it, its effect upon you, how sometimes, marketing in various ways can eclipse your biological impulses where you think, oh, like just get off it. Like, oh, it's bad for your health. We'll just stop participating in it. And you become so entwined, like you become so enmeshed within this system that not only your self-worth, but your very identity, where you have an extension, which is your avatar, what you participate and how you choose to show yourself in social media. But then that starts either deviating further away from you, or the way that you see yourself starts becoming more attached to that as you're known as that person. So there's many different aspects there. But to launch off, I think talking specifically about sponsorships, I think in ways it's a little bit better now, and here's what I mean, only because there's a plethora of options. There's more ways to get sponsored, but I do know in terms of raw numbers, to your point, Laurin, for someone to be sponsored by a large company, simple supply and demand, right, economics, there's more people willing to take these, roles to be sponsored. And what they're looking for in most brands, the fundamental question, why should you be sponsored? Or why were people in the first place, Laurin? I'm speaking now more from my side, but just like the meta conversation here, why were people sponsored? Well, maybe they have a look, right? And so you're sponsored for your physique. You're also maybe potentially sponsored for what you say, right? So the content and character therein. But usually because it's a visual medium, you're trying to sell something. I look like this, therefore you should purchase that. It's usually things related to what people would associate with, your physique. So let's say I'm speaking bodybuilders. Oh, I'm jacked. Here's something to make you jacked. Here's a supplement. Well, what slowly happened over time, I think people are acutely aware when they're being marketed to. But I think the thing that is eclipsed just how you look is kind of things that are even harder to diagnose and assess. I'll give you an example. If you put two people with very good physiques and you could judge them, it doesn't matter, and you run them in a social media campaign to, try and influence people in order to purchase certain things, apparel doesn't really matter. Immediately people will choose one person more than the other. And you could try and, categorize this. What is this? Does this person look better? Is this person more relatable? But simply put, because these are all algorithms, the function of any advertising campaign is to get the highest ROI, the return on their investment in terms of what they're paying. And what has been found, obviously, over time is that it's not just necessarily your accomplishments. So let's say, Laurin, like if you're an IFBB Pro bodybuilder, it's not like, in other sports, let's say you're a baseball star, it's things that people associate with your status as opposed to your accomplishment therein. They'll help you have that extra marketability. So let's say if you're Michael Jordan, right? Yes, you are. One, your exposure just in general is insanely massive. You're influential in the culture. Is that the same in fitness? Not necessarily so. To participate, I think, specifically in competing. So what do people look for when selecting athletes? We're talking specifically athletes, and then I'll get quickly in the last 2 minutes about people participating in social media and how it kind of distorts and warps their own point of view, their own perspective, and ultimately their identity. I would say that what they look for now, it's something that you cannot quite categorize. They'll test it out, right? And the algorithm itself will raise up certain people. Either maybe you're funny, you're relatable, you're informative, all these different avenues that you can go down. And what succeeds on, say, a Facebook, an Instagram, a TikTok, doesn't really matter. If you do well on that platform, well, then if you run advertising, campaigns with that person, they'll probably do well because they've cracked both the code, or maybe the algorithm favors them for all those various reasons that are, once again, hard to quantify. And so what ends up happening, to your point, Laurin, you see a particular look. So you said there are some people, like, let's say, influencers, where they don't compete, but maybe they just look really good and they perform well in ads. So people then want to do that. But then what happens on the flip side, now that people are being compensated, they know they're being compensated, Now they want to be compensated, so they'll do the things to try and get said money, that monetary income from either sponsorships. So you have a high supply of people, the demand remains relatively the same, and you'll kind of get this, once again, conformity where it's a homogenous either kind of look and appeal, and I won't name the specific company, but there was a time the most prominent online social media activewear company, their top 3 female athletes looked remarkably similar. Because guess what? When they tested them out in the campaign, like we talked about the recent Barbie movie, guess what? They all look like almost eerily similar, like Stepford Wives style. Because when they ran campaigns, they would have the highest return on that. So again, this is now marketing choices informing the greater space, and then people see that, oh shit, I better look like that. So that's one aspect. Now we're talking on the monetary side. Just everyone's seemingly willful participation in social media, what I'd say, you think you're the one, Eric, to your point, in charge in the driver's seat, but really it acts upon you in almost insidious ways, unknown to you, where you'll notice, like, observe your screen time, how much time you spend on social media. It slowly ticks up. Oh, you're doing better. Well, now you're kind of on it. Now you're observing other people. You're changing everything, like the cadence, the intonation, the way that you speak. Observe someone over 5 years on social media, how they conduct themselves online, what pocket or what bucket they choose to get in. And it's less you participating in the space and more you kind of conforming to aspects of the space that you think are necessary either for validation, growth, compensation, whatever it might be. So it's a weird, interwoven, once again, interconnected way that it all influences upon both a person and then that person or people in the space. But I think one thing that's clear, I think we don't know the effects, kind of like Laurin, maybe when people compete, they think they know, oh, I'm going to get hungry. I'm going to feel like that. Or maybe I might like some body image issues. But until you go through that crucible and then you emerge or you take space and perspective to understand it, I think we're still as of yet, and that's why obviously there's research currently being done, what effects it's having on us and how it informs the way we ultimately think about ourselves and others.
And you made a great point. I know we have to wrap this up, but when, say you start doing better, right? And then you say, oh, you notice you're on there a little bit more, et cetera, et cetera. I would say too, I would counter that and say sometimes if you've had some success and then things start to drop off, that's also when then you go, oh gosh, well, what am I doing wrong?
Yep.
Okay, now let me look at who's relevant. And we notice this so much in the fitness space. I mean, what are the biggest accounts, fitness accounts, big air quotes here, where they're doing these like fucking asinine workouts and everybody looks great and they're doing like, there's like 4 people at once, so they're like rolling under each other and they're doing shit. And you're just like, okay, this is flashy, this is whatever. But like, is this really what fitness Instagram is? But like, if you look at the numbers, like you would say, well, that must be because that's what's getting the attention, And so it's also, again, like full circle moment is like, this is all about like the how to stay relevant, right? And that kind of pressure and desire to stay relevant there. Because if you're on social media and you're sharing things, like the chances are you're sharing because you want people to see it, right? Like you're not just sharing that so that like you're talking to nobody. Like the whole goal is that people are going to see it and consume it. So there is this underlying pressure of like, well, do I have to do a video like that so that people will like an algorithm boosting post before I then share this, and then there's like all this weird internal pressure to fit into something that is so strange. We could definitely do another podcast on that whole topic.
Yeah, the realization that the things you want to promote and the things you believe you need to do to promote yourself start to slowly subvert one another. And even as a science-based guy, I get that. Like I look at, all right, so I make this very informative post and it does poorly because that's not what the algorithm responds to. So you first start thinking, okay, well, how can I take elements of that and tie it into this informative post so I can use those tools?
Yep.
But that slippery slope can take you to the point where one day you look up and you're doing exactly the thing that doesn't help anybody, but it gets a lot of views.
Unfortunately, I'll say, Eric, in closing, I was that iceberg slim to you. I said, oh, we're going to create some great informative content. I said, Playa, that's great. Flip off that shirt. First Rascal branded athlete, folks. He is the very first one. Has an actual Rascal apparel brand, Progressive Overload, Milo on his chest. And that's how he got in for all of eternity. And I said, bro, what you're spitting straight facts here. Do me a favor. I think it would make a lot more sense if you did it shirtless. And Eric did it at the time. He's like, that's kind of interesting. But yeah, it's.
Omar, why does that change the relevance of what I'm saying? But I'll do it. Okay.
Yeah.
And you're like, boy, I'm going to make you a star.
A star. You're a star. Yeah. Yeah. And Laurin may have labeled you a red dwarf, but Eric, I'm about to make you go supernova, so don't you worry about a thing.
Oh,
Yeah.
man. I think that's a good ending point right there. I will
Yeah.
supernova for you, baby.
Yeah. No, Laurin, thank you so much for being on. It's been too long. Where can people find you?
Yes, so on our favorite platforms,
Yeah.
Instagram,
Yeah, the gram.
just at on the gram at Laurin Conlin, LaurinConlin. Our website is teamlocofit.com. The name will likely be changing. We're going through a little bit of a rebrand refresh, but everything will be on there in terms of coaching services, either there or my Instagram. I also have a podcast called The Loco Fit Show, so we put out new episodes every week on there. Yeah. You just type my name in, you'll find me.
I love it. And let me just say, now that we actually have a shout out to Kai Homer for doing the timestamps, they're all there. They're already linked. People can see them. They can follow along with the episode. So go ahead and check Laurin out. We want to thank every single person, including Big Ron, for listening to another episode of Iron Culture. You can help us out by leaving a rating and review. And it's not just peer pressure. It's just your turn to leave a rating review. 5 stars is typically what people will leave. We'll read a review in the next episode. iTunes is the platform that we read them. There are a few others, but honestly, I don't see anyone leaving them. And they're also on platforms I've never heard before. But maybe one episode we'll, talk about that and give people the option to choose rather than iTunes having the monopoly. Nonetheless, we are back every single insert date here from now until the end of time. We'll see you in that next episode.